Mike Wilson, Uncle Carl's nephew, son of Dennis Wilson. And we're here in my restaurant in Culver City talking about Carole. I just remember him being very warm, gracious, happy to see us. You know, it was always a comforting feeling being around Carole for some reason. Even though I wasn't as close to him as I like to have been. It was just a comforting feeling. But it felt like he was the one holding it all together, I guess, you know. He brought me on tour with you guys through America, and I probably was with you guys for a week or so. And I got to spend some good time with him there. Just, you know, again, an incredible guy, soft-spoken. He just always seemed to be completely cool. That time, especially after my father died, after he sang Heaven, he would, you know, bring me out and say, "This is Dennis Wilson's son." And that was, I mean, I getting goosebumps now thinking about it, having thousands of people just, you know, cheer for your father. I mean, what an incredible feeling.
I am Carole Wilson, son of Dennis Wilson, nephew to Carole Wilson as well, named after him. One of my first experiences with Uncle Carole was after my father had passed. I had got to go on tour with the Beach Boys for 2 weeks into Canada, Vancouver, a couple other spots in the US. And the two people I really connected with at the time were you, Uncle Billy, and my Uncle Carole. And so I think that was an automatic nature he had to be there for people he cared about, his family members especially. But I was so young, trying to soak in parts of my family that I had never been around. Having Carole be the first, you know, one to really connect with like that, and you as well, meant a lot to me. So I think he stepped up in every level. I would definitely say he was what kept things together, in my opinion, from what I saw. He just seemed very level-minded and very easy to talk to and approach, and I never felt like he was somebody that I couldn't talk to. I wish I had been around more to know a lot of other things and aspects about him, but every time I saw him, every time I experienced anything with him, he always felt like he had everything together.
You know, it's really an honor to be here and to do this and to be able to, you know, share my thoughts and feelings on my Uncle Carole. And my dad was Dennis Wilson. He was my mom's first husband. And of course, you know, I was adopted by marriage. So, you know, but Dennis is actually the only dad I ever knew. He raised me from when I was a little baby all the way pretty much up until his death. So, you know, I started thinking about all the experiences and that I had with Carole and my dad, and going on tour with Billy, and when he was Dino, Desi, and Billy, and, you know, and going to Hawaii, and you know, the feelings that came up were pretty intense. You know, I really miss Carole a lot. You know, there was times when you know, I used to go up to his house, and I think his first car, I remember it was a blue convertible Pontiac or something like that, and you know, my mom and my dad would be going out to dinner or to the clubs or over to the candy store, if anybody remembers that, and the Troubadour. And Carole would take me in his convertible, and we'd go run around and hit the town. You know, we'd go down to Hamburger Hamlet when it was a big hangout down in Beverly Hills, and you know, we had a lot of fun.
I'm Carole Wilson Bloom. I was married to Dennis. I was his first wife. I'm the mother of Scott and of Jennifer. We have 4 grandchildren now, and I'm very happy to be doing this interview, mostly about Carole. When I first met Dennis was in 1963 that we started dating, the end of 1963. And shortly thereafter, Carl came over to the apartment, to Dennis's apartment, and he was pretty much a fixture there from that point on. He was very young. I think he'd just gotten his driver's license, actually. Maybe it wasn't even quite his driver's license. And he just hung around with us all the time, always wanting to go with us everywhere. You know, loved to hang out with, at that time, Scott was just a little baby, and so he played a lot with Scott and came over for dinner all the time and just liked being part of a family, of a nice family. Carl used to take Scott in the car all the time. He babysat Scott. He would come over, anything he could do to drive around, and he would take Scott in the car and take him out for ice cream or take him to the park or pick him up for us if we needed to. He did a lot of stuff for us with Scott.
Hey everybody, I'm Christian Love, son of Mike Love and the Beach Boys, and my memories of Carl. One of my best memories, or most recent memories of Carl, was him doing warm-ups. We were up in San Francisco doing some shows up there, or Beach Boys were up there doing some shows, and I was tagging along. And he was doing some vocal warm-ups, and I just remember the sweetness of his voice, and that just kind of emulated what kind of person he was. He was always such a sweet and warm person. That's when I think of Carl Wilson, that's what I think of. And it came through in the music, obviously, and would make, you know, the hair on your arm stand up when you heard him sing. And he's always been a mentor to me in my music in that way.
He would always greet you with a hug and an embrace, even if you hadn't seen, when you hadn't seen him in months and months, and, hi Addie, how are you? Good to see, and he meant it. It wasn't just, some people will come and say hi to you because it's the right thing to do. It's the, oh hi, how are you? And then bye. But with Carl, he really loved us. When he was with us, it definitely felt like family.
My name is Matt Jardine, and Carl Wilson was a mentor, an angel. He was a family member. He was a fantastic human being.
We have twins, boys, and he was very funny with them. He did all kinds of silly things that you just wouldn't expect. Laying down on the floor of the airplane, playing jokes, and yeah, he was funny, very funny.
She filled me with love to overflow. I just can't bear to let her go.
Hello, I'm Greer Upton. I'm a very old friend of Annie Wilson's. And I have wonderful memories of Carl, God bless him. I remember when he was madly in love with Annie when she was still in high school. And he was on tour, and he sent a gardenia every day to her house while he was gone on tour. The most romantic thing I've ever heard of. They were very young and very much in love.
I am Carl Wilson's sister-in-law, as I proudly say. I remember when he first dated Annie, and he brought her over to our house on Laurel Way, and he said, I want you to meet Annie, and she just was so shy. It was so cute. Long, beautiful black hair. So shy and just adorable.
I remember first we heard rumor of Carl meeting Annie. And it was like the family buzz, oh, Carl's got a girlfriend. And then we met Annie, and I will never forget the first time we met her. She was very shy and quiet, but she was so beautiful with her long, dark hair, and I even remember what she was wearing, a tight skirt, I think it was black and white, houndstooth or check, and a sweater. And she was just so beautiful and so sweet, and everybody fell in love with her right away. And Carl was madly in love with her. He was so crazy about her.
Terry and I had been offered a gig in Dick Clark's Caravan of Stars backup band. Got all the way to Pittsburgh, and we were playing at the Pittsburgh Civic Auditorium, which was the new deluxe ice skating hockey arena that opened up and all this. And Terry and I were walking around, and there was a lot of acts we were backing up. Tom Jones, Peter and Gordon, the Shirelles, the Drifters, the Chiffons, Brian Hyland, just a bunch of people. And there was going to be a few acts that were going to join us. I think Bobby Vinton was one. So all of a sudden there was talk about who was going to close the show, and everybody was getting their feathers ruffled that, we closed the show and so nobody else should. Then all of a sudden, Dick Clark's representative came up to us and said, the Beach Boys are on this show, and there's no doubt they're closing this show. So anyhow, nothing was said about this because the Beach Boys at that time, it's a Chicago phrase, but they were roaring. I don't think there was a bigger act, without getting into the English acts, the bigger American act, there wasn't. I believe a few of the fellas went by, Dennis, Mike Love, Al Jardine, but for some reason, Carole Wilson sticks out to me, and I don't know if it was kindred spirits or whatever between Terry and myself, and we were sort of standing there, and here he walked up to us, and we were like, and speechless and everything, and he went, hi, I'm Carole Wilson. We went, yeah, we know. And I says, this is Terry Kath, and I'm Walt Parazaider. It's a pleasure to meet you. Congratulations on all your success. We really enjoy your music, and we really respect what you do. Had a really friendly discussion, and it was like we were talking to somebody we had known for a long time. And you get the feeling from certain people when you're talking to them, if they want to cut away from a conversation or want to get away from you or whatever, you get the sense of that feeling. And not once did I feel like Carole was being sort of patronizing or just sort of putting up with us or whatever. And he really stood there and talked, and it was a great experience. And I guess the point to the story was later on they went on, and I never saw a place get so crazy. And this really sort of solidified for me that with this Dick Clark tour and seeing all of these acts getting a certain reaction and seeing the Beach Boys getting a super reaction like that, that I didn't somewhere along the way go, someday I'm going to do this, I'm going to put a band together, and I want to see, we're going to get a reaction like this. So you'd have to say, not only did I enjoy their music, they were an inspiration, and part of this seed, this germ I had of what I was going to do 2 years later of getting the best musicians together in the city of Chicago together to be like them and we wanted to be the Beatles with horns. And that's skipping 2 years ahead. But that germ was and seed was sort of planted with a person that was one of the kindest spirits I ever met in my life and nicest people. And I have to say this, and I'll probably repeat myself, I don't think I've ever met a nicer person in the contemporary music business, the rock and roll business, than Carole Wilson. And that was the first experience of me thinking that about him, but not the last one.
I know after Brian kind of left the scene and retired off the road, that Carole kind of became the de facto leader of the band, and he did a great job. He was he was so stable and so calm and cool and collect, and he made sure everybody was comfortable. He was always very aware of everybody's needs, and that's what I appreciated about Carole. We were just kids. 19, 20, 21, just making music and ruling the world. It was just a great time to be in rock and roll. It was a great time to have friends like the Beach Boys and Carole Wilson. Carole and I had a similar experience with the draft board. We both kind of fought it tooth and nail. I know that he was deferred because he was a conscientious objector, a CO. And I tried that too, but it wasn't working so good for me for some reason.
At the particular time that we went on the road with the Beach Boys, you know, there was 2 bands in the world. The Beatles, of course, who were tearing the world up, and of course the American Beatles, which were the Beach Boys. You know, no two other groups on earth had that much kind of, you know, that much recognition in our fields. You know, so it was, yeah, we were pretty nervous about it, to be honest. And then boom, Beach Boys tour in '68 comes about, and hello, wake up call. You know, now there's no tour bus, there's a DC-3. And so we meet at the airport, and, you know, I'm walking on the plane with the Beach Boys, which is, you know, now it's not, you know, the Music Machine, it's the Beach Boys. Now we're talking the top of the food chain, you know, in America, you know, top of the food chain, and probably in the world. Well, the Beach Boys vocally were, I mean, a work of art. So it's pretty difficult to try to critique their vocal performances. Their vocal performances are probably the best vocal group in the world at the time. You know, I mean, no one had harmonies as good as theirs. Everything was pristine, you know.
We started what turned out to be, I've often said, decades of shows together with the Beach Boys. We met at that very early time in the UK. It might have been the Lincoln Fest, but I remember a series of shows that the Beach Boys were doing. I actually recall being down in Brighton, and Mike had one of his TM, not his, but a TM center down in Brighton that he took us to. And it was at this very, very early times that we met Carole and got quite close, got to know you, Billy. But I think by '73, '74, we were gigging with the Beach Boys. The bonds that we built initially right away in England, of course, became the fabric of a lifetime friendship. Carole was living up in Coldwater, I remember, and coming and visiting that house.
Hello? ¿Dónde están, señora? Oh, bueno. Hi. Hi. Hi, Justyn.
Say hi, Uncle Billy. Hi, Uncle Billy.
Hi. You know, going on the road was always fun and always a blast, and that was the time that I got to spend with my dad. So, and it was exciting, you know, private planes usually, and big crowds and screaming people and music, and it was a kick. So yeah, lots of time on the road, and I've seen that picture many times of Carney and Wendy and Jonah all up by the microphone during Good Vibrations, and I'm just back off a little bit to the left, and I do remember that moment of them running out and kind of felt like I missed the bell or something, and standing back there and kind of feeling a little left behind, and then I think someone, you know, shuttled me up there to to do that, and that was, you know, it was fun. I remember always feeling like, wow, this is pretty wild stuff.
I'd have to say I have really great memories of being on the road and looking forward to going every year, and you know, just those great times out there. It's something so unique. It's hard to describe the feeling of being out there, you know, for a certain stretch of time. But I think that all of us kids have great memories of being out there and having fun together, and you know, watching the show from the stage and going out for the encore and all that kind of stuff.
I was originally introduced to the Beach Boys by Carole Wilson. Carole was instrumental in having us open up for the Beach Boys, and when I say us, it was when we first started out with Billy Joel, and it was one of our major breaks to be able to open up for the Beach Boys. He was in the wings, and he was there to see Billy and our band, and he was there, and religiously he always kind of showed up. He was the only guy that really showed up.
I am Vinay Nicolason. I am Justyn's mother-in-law, Justyn being Carle's son. Justyn and my daughter Britta have known each other for over 20 years. They met at Santa Monica High School, and we met Justyn when he was 15 years old. Well, of course, we went to graduations together. When the kids graduated from high school, we went to their parties, and they came to ours, and we did those special things that parents do with their children. And it was a beautiful thing for both of us, watching our children grow up together and fall in love. There's some people that just make the world a better place by being in it, and Carole was one of those people.
Bruce Johnston introduced me to the Beach Boys along with Ed Carter. 1968, Ed and I both auditioned at the same time at the Moulin Rouge on Sunset Boulevard. Carole hired us both. Carole was the man that would call the rehearsals. He was the absolute total leader of the band. Every instrument he scrutinized, keyboards, if there were horns involved, he was like another Brian, as far as I was concerned.
Catch a wave, huh? Okay, now this is my dumbbell. No, it's not echo. Okay.
Carole hired me in 1968, and he was an ultimate professional. He was detached in the sense that he wasn't overly friendly, not hostile certainly, but he was focused, and he always remained very focused on his music and what he expected of his bandmates. And didn't consider him a party guy or anything, but but I respected him. I think I admired him and respected him over the years.
Good.
Yeah, it's okay.
Done.
He was quality control on stage. He would make sure everything was just right.
No, we don't know it. We don't? We better fix it.
He was. If Carole liked what you were doing it. You would accomplish something great. He heard it all. Yeah. It was great. And sometimes you just turn around and give you a look, and you think, well, I'm not doing something right. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I'll try something else. And he'll turn around and give you a little nod, like that's it. That was it. That's what I wanted. It was the greatest feeling. When he turned around on stage and gave you the smile, it was like, ah.
He was very charismatic, very professional guy. He showed me a lot of things. I thought I knew how to be professional, and I found out very quickly that I wasn't as professional as I thought, thanks to him, because the things that he really impressed upon me at the time were professionalism, being on time, paying a close attention to the details and all the little things that make up a good performance, and bringing that same thought and feeling and just, perseverance every night.
Carl was the guy at rehearsals every day, and he was with the band. He was the beach boy at rehearsals. He was the one that, was working with Mike Maris and working with Billy Hinsche and working with all. Carl was putting the show together, and of course we spent a lot more time because as being a tour manager at that time, that was where most of my work was.
If Carl didn't like somebody, you knew it. And there weren't too many people that Carl didn't like, but you knew it. And he was no bullshitter, that's one thing. He just, most tender, angel, most wonderful, always, I would say he's, if I only had to choose from two people in the whole world who were, the nicest, most wonderful people, Carl's definitely one of them.
No one knew what he was angry about, but they knew he was angry at something. And I think that was about as far as it went. I don't think he was ever very open about what he was angry about. I think it was kind of a private thing for him. I never really saw him ever really, it was kind of an internal thing, I think. Anyway, from what I noticed, it was never as open as like some people are.
I know that he had some hard edges, and I saw them, and I could see Carl get riled up, but very, very rarely.
When I first started dating Al, Carl was on tour. So I had been with the Beach Boys for a little while first, and then he came back into the band. And so I was already kind of there for a little while, and so he came back in, and of course he knew everyone but didn't know me, so it was kind of a get-to-know-you time, and he was very sweet and very kind. And I remember meeting Gina for the first time. Then Carl and I got to be friends right away because I made friends with Gina.
I am Alan Krieger, commonly known as Krieger, by my last name actually. So at one time in my life I was blessed to be the drummer with Carl Wilson from the years 1979 to 1983. And it was 4 great years with him. Boom. His writing partner at the time was the beautiful Myrna Smith, who was also one of the sweet inspirations with the Elvis Presley show. And the bass player with that group was Gerald Johnson, who was also a member of the Steve Miller Band at one time too. And at that time, before Carl Wilson, I was actually the drummer with Ike and Tina Turner the last 4 years of their career. And then when Ike and Tina broke up, I had a little R&B soul group, and Gerald Johnson was the bass player at the time. And then Myrna got wind of our band, and she heard us. And then even one time at the Montebello Country Club is where Myrna brought Carl Wilson, and Myrna was babysitting Lisa Marie Presley that day, and she brought her. She was like 11 years old then, and Carl's manager, Jerry Schilling, and they saw our group, and they were blown away. And then Carl hired our band, and it was all self-contained with the guitar, bass, and drums. He couldn't use the horn player, but then he used the rhythm section, and that's how Carl's rhythm section. It was all locked up that one night with Lisa Marie, Carl, and Myrna.
Who was your guitar player?
The guitar player I just mentioned, it was John Daly. But that's right, yeah, John Daly. Maybe I didn't, but John Daly was the guitar player. The great Billy Hinsche.
That's what I'm talking about.
I remember him. Now, I thought he was cool with the Dino Desi and Billy gig there back in the 60s, because I remember hearing about that. And then, got to meet him, and, I was very, very inspired, and Carl liked having him aboard. Of anybody from the Beach Boys, Billy was the only one that was included in that sector. So that's one thing I got to say of all the Beach Boys that were in the musicians of that band, Billy was the only one that Carl wanted out of that band to be with. I'm telling you right now, when I played with Carl, I was completely blown away, just at the amount of talent. And at that time, it was youth and stuff, and when I got to experience playing with Carl, it showed more maturity and experiencing the Beach Boys sound, which Carl was a major part of. You know, it was so present even in our band that I was just blown away and got rushes and goosebumps always in my body, even every night I performed with him. It was always an inspirational pleasure. His solo material, it was him just trying to express a feeling and getting away just from being typecast with the Beach Boys. And also at the end of that, at that era, it was still like the end of the disco era, and music was still going through a few transformations, I think, in that 79 to 83 era, because it was, you know, it was a thing. But we did get on tour with the Doobie Brothers. They asked us back to even on an extended tour with them. You know, we were doing the American Bandstand shows, the Solid Gold, you know, all those, Tom Snyder even did his show, you know. So we were getting some great publicity, and you know, I just wish it would have taken off a little bit more for him, you know, because it could have been a whole great thing just having him performing, doing more solo albums.
I remember when we stopped opening up for the Beach Boys, I maintained a connection with Carl through Jerry Schilling, and we went to see Carl when he came into town. He was doing his solo career. It was awesome, you know, to see Carl doing his solo career, and I remember seeing him at the Bottom Line, so I kept a relationship with him.
Carl was already doing a solo career and had already done one album before he left the Beach Boys. He left the Beach Boys out of love of the music, and he felt that they were not putting the rehearsals, they were not doing new stuff. It had nothing to do with his solo career, not one thing in the world. We were going into the second album. It had to do with the creative or lack of creativity in Carl's mind of the Beach Boys at the time. And that's when the statement came out, I will come back to the Beach Boys when 1981 is as important as 1961. I hope people will remember this, but Carl left the Beach Boys not for selfish reasons, but for artistic reasons. And he came back and he made a difference, and he was right.
It was a very funny first meeting. We were in, I think it was Paris, and Carl had come to see the show. And he wasn't on stage, and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, Carl Wilson's going to be here. And I'd never met him. You know, I'd met Brian, and I was playing in the band, but I'd been playing in the band for months at this point, and Carl decided to come back and rejoin the band and stop his solo touring. And so I really wanted to impress him, and I really wanted to play well and sing well, and so I was doing my very best, ding, 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 you know, if everybody had a ding, 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 you know, these little surf licks that he would play. And, you know, 409, I did the solo in Catch a Wave, all these other things, and number one, I was playing a Fender Jaguar guitar because that's what he had played in the early days, and I wanted to replicate the sound of the Fender Jag. I thought, this is how you do it. You know, you buy the same guitar that Carl had, and this is how you play the surf songs. And so I walked off stage, and there was Carl on the side of the stage, and I walked over to him and I said, hey man, it's so nice to meet you. It's really a great, you know, and did you notice I was playing the original surf licks? He said, yeah, Jeff, you know, the guitar has 6 strings. I suggest you use them all. I thought, oh man, okay man, you know.
The first time I actually met Carl was at my very first gig, which was at the Calgary Stampede in Calgary, Canada, and that was the first time I met him, was at a sound check, and got to know Carl and realized right away, and what struck me was his command of the band at the time. He was really the music director and the leader of the Beach Boys band, and insisted on the quality of the music in each and every turn. If you played a wrong note, as you know, Billy, you got a little bit of stink eye from Carl, and you made an adjustment right away to make sure that every note you were playing was the right note. And in the same way, all of the technical side, the monitors, the lighting, the sound, and all that, Carl had a huge hand in directing how all of that looked and sounded as well. So Carl was really the quality control for the Beach Boys, and on the odd occasion when Carl was not there, it was a little bit of a different band and a little bit of a different stage presence for the band.
He was the type of person that when you were in the room with him, there was that sense of you're in the presence of someone very special. And he always went out of his way to treat us like we were family, because in a sense we were a family touring on the road. You spent more time in close proximity with these people than anyone else in your lifetime. And he was the type of person where he let you know that you were appreciated and you were valued, and he was just a very warm and caring person.
I just remember him just treating people really well, and just taking the time to always appreciate his fans and the people that supported them. And I think he really did. I don't think he felt like he had to. I think he just felt appreciative and felt very lucky for the success that he had his whole life. So I don't think he ever took that for granted.
I'm Alice Lilly. I'm president of the Beach Boys fan club. Ever since 1976, right up until now, oh yes, that would be 32 years. He always took care of not just my needs, but also the needs of other fans who went to concerts with me. Our California state representative, she traveled with me to concerts on many occasions, and other people who he got to know pretty well that lived in the Southern California area. He always took care of our needs. He's the guy who pulled the strings necessary to get me and a couple other people laminate passes to backstage. I could go to backstage to any Beach Boys concert for a whole year on one of those laminates. He's the guy who did that. Shortly after I became the official fan club president, I went one day down to the recording studio in Santa Monica to pick up the mail, and they asked me if I'd like to meet Carl. Of course I said yes, of course I would. And Carl came out and he gave me a big bear hug that must have been 5 minutes.
I saw many memorable shows with the Beach Boys and Carl, and I got to meet Carl quite a few times between 1979 and 1983, the time I was working in radio, and had a number of meetings, basically as a starstruck fan, handing him an album. I remember handing him an album, an LA Light album, a radio station promo copy in like August of 1979, and by that point the album had basically come and gone. It had done what it was going to do, and I remember seeing just a little, I don't want to say regret in his face, but I knew that it hadn't lived up to everybody's expectations, and I thought it was a great album, and I told him so, and he seemed to appreciate that.
A lot of people would say I'm a very, very big Beach Boys fan. I've been a huge Beach Boys fan for as long as I can remember. Even though I'm not, I'm certainly not old enough to remember being there in person, but the music and the members and personally have affected my life in a very, very significant way. Whenever I would watch Carl or I'd see footage of Carl, or anything he had to do with the band, I always thought it was really, really evident that he was kind of keeping everything together, musically, and maybe outside of what you saw on the stage. And then of course later on you read in all the books and you see in the movies that in fact was true, that he was the stabilizing force, if you will, and. It's just a lot of very, very inspirational, just not only as a musician, But when you hear stories about how he was pretty much the peacemaker in the band, I think that's a very important role to fill.
Started off actually working with Mike Meros as his keyboard tech, and then when Dale Martell left, I moved over and became Carl Wilson's guitar tech. Well, my experience with Carl, he was a very gracious person to work with. We didn't have a lot of time together because obviously the schedule was pretty tight, but he was such a gentleman and a very, very gracious and kind person. And I always remember just my interactions with him were very, he was very thoughtful.
Carl and I started learning to play guitars together when I was 10 and he was 12. And our friend John Walker, his name was John Moss at the time, he was from our neighborhood down, maybe a quarter of a mile down, and he became one of the Walker brothers. But he was our first guitar mentor. He taught us our first guitar chords. And he actually learned some of his stuff from Ritchie Valens. So that's a cool, generational thing there. And Carl and I had a musical language together. Like Carl had his voice with his brothers and the way they blended his brothers. We kind of had that with the guitar. A lot of those early records we played the same rhythm riff, and it mingled, and it was like sort of it's kind of almost like the beginnings of punk. We just blended and created our own unique sound, I believe. Just our influences like Dick Dale, Chuck Berry, Duane Eddy, Ventures, all those influences, and so the local guys too, like the Bel Airs. And we just merged all that stuff together. We played every day together after school. We would play outside, on the street, in the kitchen, on the floor, on the sidewalk. We'd always be playing guitars together. And it just it evolved into the Beach Boys sound.
Well, what I remember is Carl would come with his guitar, and Brian would usually always have the parts already in his head of what he wanted Carl to play. And Carl, of course, would play exactly what Brian wanted. And, Carl just a big supporter of Brian and the music.
When a lot of the studio musicians were being brought in, it didn't replace Carl. Carl was still there playing the guitar, and right along with all the great studio cats of the day, because Carl not only had a distinctive voice, but he had a distinctive guitar style, that kind of Chuck Berry-esque guitar style that was very recognizable, especially in those cartoons and those surf tunes, and I really appreciated that he managed to develop his own vocal style and his own guitar style. So I have to tip my hat to Carl for that.
One of the things that I never really thought about was that, and didn't really realize or pay attention to, was his love of R&B music and Chuck Berry and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I remembered hearing about it, but I kind of realized it more after he's gone than when he was here, how much that music meant to him and affected him. And I think that's an interesting part of him that, unless you're, a really big fan that knows all the history, you may not know that. And that he was really moved by that music. And I just kind of find that interesting.
Carl's guitar playing has this very interesting root, because it's Yeah, in as much as it's rooted in early rock and roll, it has a very California sound, and by that I mean there's a certain aesthetic to California guitar players like Dick Dale, and to a greater degree, I think even Richie Valens, who was a great guitar player who people didn't necessarily acknowledge as a guitar player until long after his passing, and I think that's where Carl's, his style really grew out of, is that sort of thing.
I grew up in Southern California. Carl was one of my guitar heroes, and to this day there's a couple of guitar intros that he played that to me are the epitome of the Southern California guitar sound.
I think in terms of serving the song, and obviously the Beach Boys, in the Beach Boys, you learned all about that, how the instrumentation and the arrangement as a whole works for the optimization of the song. He got the job done. He knew what he was doing, and he did it without any degree of flash, because that's not what the job that he was doing on the instrument was.
Not to take anything away from Al, but Carl kept every one of those songs driving forward. I mean, that whole rig he had with the Epiphones and Gibsons, the 12 strings and stuff, this was a vital part of that sound. And just as if you were to break it apart and say that, sure enough, Brian took the Four Freshmen and combined it with Chuck Berry or something, you could say that Carl kind of did the same thing, but you would never see Chuck Berry playing a Gibson 12-string electric. I mean, these things were adjustments that Carl made to fill that sound out.
Well, come on, the guy invented surf guitar leads. I mean, there's like, nobody has done it better. I mean, he took the Chuck Berry thing, completely expanded that form, and his rhythm style was unbelievably unique. I mean, all three of the Wilson brothers have a unusual, cool sense of rhythm. I mean, Brian on piano, it's like a definite feel that nobody else has. Dennis had that same thing on drums, and Carl obviously on guitar. Like the song Angel Come Home, the whole plucking eighth note thing that he did, just very unique, incredible things that he did.
He was one of the best guitar players on the planet. There was a lot of songs that I thought he absolutely shone on, particularly one of them was Fun, Fun, Fun.
You could have a guitar player that could shred, for days, and play like Slash, but can't get, like the riff in Dance, 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 which I always thought was very interesting. That says a lot. Things that sound simple are actually very complex when you try to perform them yourself.
We have all of his guitars, his stage guitars, and he used to say, people might assume that there's so many of them, but there's actually not a ton, maybe a dozen or so. But yeah, some pretty special guitars, Old Yeller, and his Strats, and the Gibson Epiphone.
He also had his Epiphone Riviera 12 strings that he was using. And that blew my mind because I didn't know Epiphone made a 12 string. And so then I looked through all the Beach Boy books and saw, he had double bound Rickenbacker 12s. He had the 360 round edge 12s. I thought, man, this guy has the guitar collection of doom. And it was just incredible, the instruments he pulled out and played just on a pedestrian show. Well, when he pulled out Old Yeller, one of the very first Stratocasters ever made, if not the first Stratocaster ever made. I mean, any guitar guy goes nuts looking at that because it's of the history involved with it. And I'm glad that Carl owned it, I'm glad that it was his guitar because he deserved it. They put Fender on the map, literally, the Beach Boys. I noticed the way that he played his B chord on the guitar was different than anybody else that I'd ever seen play the B chord. He did a first position G formation on the 7th fret. And I mean, to me, that was brand new. I'd never seen that. And I said, Carl, what chord is that you're playing? He said, that's a B. And I said, where did you learn that? He said, from Chuck Berry. And I thought, oh, wow.
He played wonderful rhythm guitar. His leads were impeccable. His leads were on the records. The combination of his rhythm and Al's rhythm was the sound of the Beach Boys. Whether he played sixth string, whether he played a Fender, whether he played a Rickenbacker, whether he played an Epiphone, or whether he played the 12 string. He was very conscious of his own sound as well too. And he listened to everybody. He listened to all the other guitar players. A lot of them were his friends. And he learned from them as well too. And believe me, the other people, the other guitarists, quite famous, learned from Carole as well too.
Yes, well, I mean, he sort of was setting a style with that kind of music. So, yeah, I mean, there was nothing else like the way how he played and sang. It was incredible. I mean, there'll be no one else like him.
When I was working with Carole in the studio, he was playing a guitar part, and he played it, and he nailed it. And then, before he'd even got the okay from, I think it might have been Phil Galston who was producing, Carole had started micro-tuning the guitar, going through every string to just tune it off, really, frankly, just the slightest little bit of every string, so that when he doubled it, it would be like what we call chorusing, basically, but he was going to replay it while it was all fresh in his mind. His memory, of course, was fantastic, and he could double vocals, but he could also do the same thing with guitar. But this kind of thing where he went through every string and tuned it either semi-down, just the slightest bit, or up, was this technique that he had perfected over the years, and it was fantastic, because he would then double the guitar, and because it was just slightly off, it thickened the sound. You split that left and right, and it was all part of his sound.
He could rock. I remember us doing that one song, The Right Lane, which was on the first album. And that was the first time I got to actually, because we were trying to get him a little bit more on the harder side, and that was one of the songs that we did on this first album, was The Right Lane. And you can even hear that he liked doing those little rock and roll riffs, you know, he had that groove going, and then it was nice to see him even strut around, you know, like, this is what I want to be doing, and I am so proud I am in the right lane, baby.
Carole Wilson was using our guitar on and off through the years, very highly visible with it. He also seemed to be the type of person that projected the image that we felt was consistent with our product. And it was really a great honor for us to meet Carole after seeing him in the Beach Boys for so many years. Really kind, gracious guy, just down to earth, really pleasant to sit down, talk with in the office. Carole visited us with the understanding that we were going to speak about making a guitar that was a limited edition with his name on it, and we came into the conversation with no preconceived ideas. We were receptive to hear what he was interested in, and we wanted to talk about kinds of things that we could do together. And we worked to come up with things that were actually possible to build in our factory, and discussed what he had played. The concept wasn't so much as to recreate a guitar that he'd used, but more like a dream guitar, or making the guitar the way he always would like to have had a guitar. And the first round, we came up with a solid body guitar that was a completely different animal than what he had been used to in the past. And actually, it's hanging on the wall behind us. This was an instrument that started out as the earliest prototype in working with Carole. He saw this instrument in its very earliest rough form without any hardware, and he had some ideas on some shape changes and things that he'd like on it. Unfortunately, he passed on before we were able to complete it. So I went ahead on my own and finished this instrument the way I thought Carole would like to have had it, with the check binding on the body, and the type of hardware that I would have imagined. This was only one of the ideas that we discussed with Carl, and subsequently we actually did go in a little different direction, a little closer to his original instrument. Carl's family met with us, and we were able to come together and choose one of the models that we had under discussion and develop it a little bit further in the spirit of the way we thought Carl would like to have had his guitar. We produced 500 units of the Carl Wilson limited edition, and it was very successful. The very thin top was quite well received by guitar players, and it's still something that is highly collectible, and we hear collectors are always out there looking for a Carl Wilson guitar.
Here and now, here and now, here and now, here and now.
At about age 15, when he was about 15, he started singing Stevie Wonder songs. He started learning how to sing from rhythm and blues stations that he had, radio stations. My brother Carl Wilson was probably in the top 5 all-time great singers.
He is and was my favorite singer of all time. And I am honored to have known and worked and recorded with Carl. There is so many qualities about that voice that I think the deeper you get into it, the more amazing it was. And I can tell you, I've been in LA now for 30-some years, almost 40 years, and it is no secret among singers. It doesn't matter if you talk to Michael McDonald or Christopher Cross or other people who are known for very unique voices of their own. Virtually to a man, they'll put Carl right at the top of that list. And, you know, I like to say it's no secret, but I think that if you get somewhat out of that circle of people, people might not really know. I mean, Brian has such a legacy in this business, and we all hold Brian so high, including George Martin, who I worked for many, many years. You know, we all put Brian just right at the top of the creative minds of our genre of pop music. So sometimes Carl might be overlooked a little bit, and if you don't know the breakdown of who did what, some people might not know that it's Carl who sang those songs. But if it's pointed out to you, I mean, there is just a uniqueness to this character, and it got better. I did the Like a Brother album with Carl and our good friend Robert Lamb, and I tell you, it was a humbling experience to, you know, I like to think I can carry a tune myself, but boy, to be in the studio daily with that guy and be singing harmonies, and it was a challenge to say the least.
Darling, darling, I dream about you often, my pretty darling. That one, great.
Every time I hear his voice, it really truly is a voice of an angel. He taught me so much about phrasing, about easing into notes, laying back. He just had so much soul. I think the way people feel music is where they hit the notes, whether they're on the beat, ahead of the beat, behind the beat. And I just love the way Carl always eased in and laid it back a little, and it was so mellow and it was so loving and nurturing and comforting. And that's what I try to go for sometimes. I feel like that's what inspires me to in a vocal performance. And it was so much a part of the Beach Boys sound, was that sort of laid back sincerity. And it's just magic. It's just magic.
His voice healed me. When I was going through a lot of bad things, his voice helped me out a lot.
There's millions of voices, millions and millions of voices, but what's a great voice? To me, a great voice is a voice that I hear that separates itself from everybody else. You know, I think Rod Stewart's got a great voice. When people say Rod Stewart's voice sucks, well, you know what? That's to your ear, okay? I think that you know, Steve Perry had one of the greatest rock voices ever. Okay, that's my opinion. But when you hear him sing, there's nobody else that sounds like him. That's what I think are great voices. Carl Wilson, same thing. You know, John Lennon, same thing. Paul McCartney, same thing. They have separation. You can't confuse them with another voice, you know. That's who they are. There's only one of them. When you're one of them, when you're just one of them, then you're great. Even Bob Dylan, he's one of them. He's not, I don't particularly like the quality of Bob Dylan's voice, but I think he's a great singer.
I was amazed to realize that, you know, I'd listened to all of the Beach Boy records growing up, all of them that were released up to that point. And when I saw the Beach Boys, it was the early 70s, 71 or 72, I was amazed that Carole was singing all of the falsetto parts then, as well as playing all of the guitar lead solos, as well as leading the band. Michael, of course, was the front man and was always out front as the lead singer. Dennis was standing up front and, you know, doing this to the audience and getting the chicks to scream and things and bring your hands up, let's, you know, come on everybody, get into it. You know, he didn't have to do much because everybody was focused on Dennis. But it was Carole's band musically and esoterically, you know, and he wanted it to be right. And I could tell that even then. I had been a player for some time, and it was very obvious to me that he was the band leader, and he sang so beautifully. You know, Carole told me, and I'm sure he learned this from Brian, but he told me, is don't ever use vibrato on your voice when you're singing in a group, because you'll never match up the vibrato. As a matter of fact, the Bee Gees are the only guys that have ever done that, as far as I know. And I'm sure they worked at it and worked at it and worked at it. But I remember singing one of my first sessions with the Beach Boys in the studio, and I ended my little note with a little vibrato, and man, he stopped the session cold and said, don't ever do that. You know, you could never match, just make it clean. And I thought, wow, okay. So I've never sung with vibrato since then on a group situation.
How about the time he left the guitar and took the microphone and sang that single he did, What You Do to Me?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell the folks about that whole thing? It was different.
It was totally different, you know.
Forced him to go beyond his comfort level.
Yeah, actually putting down a guitar and actually getting out there and like to be able to schmooze with the audience and get right in their face, you know, instead of, which was another whole thing I don't think he ever did with the Beach Boys, is getting out there with the solo microphone and, you know, and mingling with, you know, all of the stage like that. Yeah, so, you know, and that was another new thing that Carole never did. That's true.
Carl Wilson is the guy with the voice. Carl Wilson had the most beautiful, soulful sound, in my opinion. He was the passion of the Beach Boys.
As a singer, I think Carl Wilson was probably the single most influential influence on me, because I'm a vocalist, and just the way he, very easy way to his voice. It's very hard to describe. The word angelic comes up a lot with him when they talk about his voice and his personality, and that's the perfect word to describe it. And I was also very impressed with how, as he got older, his voice got more soulful, and you know, and he, when you listen to the later Beach Boys albums, like their album from '85, where Carl took a lot of lead vocals and, you know, had that real gritty sound. He always had I always thought he had the best voice out of all of them. Just a real cool, gritty and soulful voice. But then at the same time, he could sound, you know, like an angel.
Oh, Soul Searching. That was great. That was great.
You know, what you're going to remember about Carl is just the sweetness and the clarity and the way I'm always reminding Brian, you know, because I think Brian taught Carl to do it this way, but the way they hit the note and then they back off and then they come back. And it's just that dynamic sensibility that I think is so special, and Carl really was the master of that.
It's funny. I don't know that it was the voice Carl wanted, maybe. I think maybe he wanted a different kind of, maybe more of a rock and roll voice, but he had the most angelic, beautiful voice that anyone could ever dream of hearing. It was wonderful.
I think his voice absolutely reflects the human being.
You know, it was no surprise, and I've known a lot of people in this business. I've been fortunate to meet people all over the world that have played and sung music. And some people have disappointed me that they've played their instrument so well, or they've sung so well, they really weren't all that nice. But the way Carole sang was the way Carole conducted his life and the way he lived. And to me, what you heard that came out of his mouth singing was his being and the way he conducted himself.
Well, one thing that I remember about Carole is that, you know, he was known for his voice, and people would like for him to make up background parts and sing on their recordings. And when that would happen, he would go, he'd get a good headphone mix, he'd go out and stand in the studio, he'd put one hand in his pocket, and he'd sort of look halfway up in the air, and he'd just start jamming, just singing behind the song. And maybe we'd rewind the tape 2 or 3 times, and he'd say, well, I like that. And then we'd come in, and with that general shape of a vocal, then we'd start building. You know, he'd maybe sing harmonies to it, he'd get some of the other guys to do parts, and he would lay, you know, that would be his contribution to background singing for whoever was asking him to do it. And it was painless, and it just came out of his head.
I'm just a guy that plays guitar in bands in Southern California. But he liked my stuff, and I was just so honored. It was unbelievable. I remember he was like a kid in a candy store. He was doing all the vocals, all the background vocals, and he would you'd see him thinking out there, and he'd go, one time I remember he goes, I'm gonna do an 11th, at which time I suggested he might want to consider singing professionally. And we all cracked up and stuff, but he was really having a blast, and he was trying to just get these little vocal tweaks in there that you could tell that were just so Beach Boy and so amazing, and how lucky was I.
Ooh la 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 la, ooh la 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 la, ooh la 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 la.
Let's talk about Carole's voice, especially I like to point to arguably 2 of the greatest songs ever recorded, Good Vibes and God Only Knows, that Carole sang on.
Mm-hmm.
Your impression of Carole as a vocalist, in particular those songs, are they the 2 greatest songs possibly ever recorded?
Well, if you ask Paul McCartney, he'd probably agree. God Only Knows. I know he's quoted as saying. I tend to agree in that case. I mean, I can tell you every time Rolling Stone comes out with another list, you can just watch all of the debate fly.
If you think about Carole's voice, it's probably one of the best voices in rock and roll. And when you think about the songs that he did, like God Only Knows or Darlin', but especially God Only Knows, just that sweet, angelic voice, as some people have referred to it. And I know that the media has often said that God Only Knows is Paul McCartney's favorite Beach Boys song, but you know, you can put me on that list too. I always stop to listen to it when it's on the radio, or whenever I listen to Beach Boy music, I always kind of want to hear that one. And because of that, you know, I think Carole has found his place in rock and roll history. And I know that Brian, his brother, has been quoted many times saying that he couldn't have done what he did without Carole by his side, you know. And so when you think about the lyrics of God Only Knows, it's kind of, yeah, maybe it is about a romantic thing, a relationship, but then if you think about Brian's intent, maybe he was also, maybe there's another meaning there, that God only knows what I'd be without you. Because with his brother, Carole, by his side, as his right-hand man, Brian did great things, but I'm sure that Carole had a lot to do with it.
I think God Only Knows is one of my favorite songs. You know, I loved listening to it mainly because of Carole's voice. He had this angelic voice, and but there was something more to it, something very spiritual about it, that when he sings like God Only Knows, or any of his own songs from his album, you really believe what he's saying. It really comes through. It wasn't just singing words, it came from his heart, from his soul.
God Only Knows was
no one can sing it but Carole. That was for Carole. His voice, there's no way to describe it. You know, I mean, it's totally the way the song should be.
I absolutely remember hearing God Only Knows and seeing Carole with a single spotlight on him playing a Hofner bass, singing God Only Knows, and thinking, wow, stunning.
Well, when he sang God Only Knows, it was just, what more could you ask for? It's fantastic.
God Only Knows, I mean, I'm more of a Good Vibrations guy, but as a ballad, God Only Knows is a beautiful, beautiful ballad, you know, I mean, probably one of the best that they've ever written.
God Only Knows is, you know, has gone down in history as one of the greatest pop vocals of all time, you know, and Good Vibrations and I Can Hear Music, and, you know, the list goes on and on.
And I guess I didn't realize until I saw him live that he was the one whose voice was on God Only Knows. I naturally assumed it was Brian. And I Can Hear Music, I naturally assumed that was Brian. I thought everything high in the band was Brian, you know, but then seeing it, I thought, oh my gosh, you know, this guy has one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard, probably the most beautiful voice I've ever heard.
When I heard God Only Knows, I started to figure out that there was another voice involved, and it was heavenly.
It was perfect. I mean, his voice, perfect for Good Vibrations. And it just blew Brian away. I always thought that Carole was the closest voice to Brian's voice out of everybody in the group. Obviously, because it was his brother, but Carole could sing the falsetto like Brian. And that's what, you know, Brian sometimes wasn't comfortable just doing all the leads himself, so Carole was the perfect person to put in there. And plus the fact Carole was the one going on tour, where Brian wasn't going on tour. So Carole was the perfect voice.
He sang the lead of the verses of Good Vibrations, so, you know, it was full of good vibes. And it's one of our very, very most spiritual records, you know. And his voice was very spiritual, you know.
Wouldn't it be nice, Sloop John B., those songs, I just associate them with driving down to the Jersey Shore in the summertime. Good Vibrations, of course.
Good Vibrations? Good Vibrations was my opinion, the best record ever made. And I think it was must have been really difficult for them to do it live, but they did a good job. They did it very well. And I just think Carle's voice was, boy, not from this planet.
Well, for me, it was finding out, when I was a kid, I loved all the songs that I subsequently found out Carole sang lead on, like, you know, Good Vibrations, God Only Knows, things like that. And just knowing how amazing, what an amazing talent he was at such a young age, too, you know. And I wish, when I first met Brian, that was in, we started playing in like late 98, early 99, we just had missed him, you know, but I could imagine if he was part of this whole thing, how amazing it would have been, you know.
Good Vibrations is legendary. Good Vibrations has so many layers that when you peel away the layers, the one thing that always remains constant is Carole Wilson's voice. I mean, there's a lot of instrumental magic happening. There's a lot of dimension in the way it was produced. And of course, I think it took over a year to produce that song. And Brian went through so many different stages of insanity to get that thing produced, you know. And it was wild that he came out with such, as he calls it, a pocket symphony. But what would it have been like without Carole Wilson? You know, with his voice, that angelic voice, that beauty.
Carle's breath, just in the beginning of Good Vibes, you know, Good Vibrations, it was just like Carole is singing. He had, to me, the golden throat, that velvet throat, that velvet voice that you would hear in the Beach Boys, and you would recognize his voice. And then after the years that we've played with him, of course, you know, I mean, you feel his presence in his voice. You just knew it was Carl singing.
And our producer called me up. He says, I was just at the greatest recording session that I've ever been at. And I said, who'd you see, who'd you hear? He says, I just heard the Beach Boys record Good Vibrations. So probably the most incredible song I've ever seen put together. The first time I heard it, and I just came out of the dressing room, and it was like a magnet. I just had to go right up and sneak onto the stage and watch Carl sing, because I couldn't believe that I was actually being treated to something live. And I knew it was going to happen and everything else, but it was surreal, because here I had heard this, I was a fan, and I was hearing some of the most incredible God-given talent play music that was celestial, surreal, and just wonderful. And to be a part of that, I'll never forget how as I've said before, I'll never forget how I felt. And I don't think there was a night, and Fun, and all of and Sloop John B. and all those songs, great songs. There wasn't a night that I didn't come up and sneak up to hear those two songs, just to get my Beach Boys fix.
I still have a hard time hearing them actually now. I mean, without thinking of him in a pleasant way, not in a bad way. Also, Caroline No, which to me still is Carl's voice. In my heart, it is anyway, because he sang it so beautifully on stage. And those songs are still his, and always will be. They're beautiful. He was such a leader of the band. He kept everyone in line and in focus. The control, I don't think people really understood how important it is, the timing of the songs, the order in which they go, and everyone's temperament, that he kept an even keel all the time. That's a very difficult thing to do, not just the Beach Boys themselves, but the entire band behind it and the crew. And he treated everyone equally and openly good and kind. I mean, he didn't treat the crew, the band, the Beach Boys people different than anyone else. Between making Al happy and Mike happy and the band happy and the crew happy, it's like a negotiation, and not everyone is getting what they want, but everyone is getting something that they want, and it's that kind of negotiating all the time, and you don't really see him doing it, but that's what he was doing, and that was very important.
Carl is the kind of like the core on stage. I mean, you know, he's sang in the middle, he was positioned in the middle, he was the leader most of the time, I think, after Brian left, and you know, Carl just is the one who kept it all together and who was the dependable one, who just was like boom, 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 totally professional. And everyone, you know, loved him because he was genuine.
I think Carl was sort of like the glue that held everybody together. He was the one who was always trying to smooth out any problems that everybody had. If anybody was angry with anybody, Carl would be the first one to go in there and try and make everything okay. He was always wanted things to be calm and to get things done. If Dennis was acting up, Carl would be right there to talk to him and say, "Come on, Dennis, come on, you can do this, come on, do it, forget this or that." And the same thing, you know, with Mike or with, not too much with Brian, but I think Carl was always the one who was, you know, counted on to smooth things over if there were any problems. I actually remember at family get-togethers at the Wilsons, at Audrey and Murray's, that if there was any discord at all, Carl immediately was the one who was trying to make everybody calm down or make things smooth or get everybody to work together on something. It just was part of his personality. I think he had a lot of responsibility, or he felt he had a lot of responsibility to keep things going smooth. I think a lot of it came from his childhood and growing up in the house with Audrey and Murray and his brothers. I think he just was always counted on to, you know, make things okay.
Carole was definitely the chairman of all of this, and I've heard it. I've heard a lot of words used, all positive, of course, about his role. The glue, you know, he held everything together. It's a very, very, you know, complicated series of blood. You know, a lot of family, a lot of frictions and things. Bands, you know, who spend a lot of time together, there's friction regardless. But in Carole's case, he was not only, I mean, you could say, you know, dictators are the glue and dictators are the chairman and stuff, but Carole didn't do it that way. He had an immense ability to steer, but with respect.
I think Carole actually was the foundation, really. He was the you know, the real cornerstone when it came to the production and the quality, and he was the, yeah, I would say he was like the father of the band, really.
When we would travel, he'd make sure that there was always a good hotel for us, the best hotels for us. He always made sure that we had rest before or after, or some type where we weren't stressed out. There was always that time when we worked hard, but there was always a time that he made sure our Australian trips, we would get there way before, a couple, 3-4 days to chill out. That's usually doesn't happen on a rock and roll tour. You get there the day before and you gig the next day. He was fair. He was tough because Carole was the music police on stage, and Carole knew everyone's part as far as I'm concerned. There was nothing that got by Carole.
Carole had a serious side to him as well, and I think where I saw it most evident was when Brian came around. You know, in those days, there were a few times when Brian Wilson actually joined the band on stage for a performance. And I remember the first time that Brian came out to a gig, the whole, not just Carole's demeanor, but the whole band's demeanor really changed. And there was a very respectful air amongst everyone on stage toward Brian. I mean, it was clear that everybody revered Brian, and they changed what they did and how they rehearsed when Brian was around. So that's when I saw Carole's really serious side in getting everyone to pay attention to Brian, getting Brian focused as well, because that wasn't an easy job. And I think that's when Brian and Carole were most evident in their brother relationship. And it was an amazing thing to watch, to see them as siblings and loving brothers as well as bandmates. I would like people to know how human Carole was. I mean, he had his faults and he recognized them. He had his tender moments, he had his brash moments, he had his funny moments, his serious moments. But Carole was an excellent musician, and I'm not sure how many people really understand that. How much he drove the musicianship of the band, and how much he was the quality control of the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys now, without Carole, are a very, very different entertainment act. With Carole, he kept them true to the music, true to the recordings.
In live performances, it's more fun just to let it rip, just to play and sing, and to maybe punch a little more or something, or just change the things around, make it more interesting to play.
And in fact, I think the thing that really impressed me, and this was on my very first gig with the Beach Boys, I was impressed by how much better they actually sounded in concert than even on the records.
With the experience we've had, we're interested in having the sound affect the nervous system in a positive way, or to have it affect the emotions in a good way. We're very interested in that.
I came across the Beach Boys path probably the early 70s, maybe 73, I'm feeling like. And they had just finished the Holland album. This was the time in history when 24-track tape recorders were coming coming around. And so the Beach Boys, always getting the latest gear, bought a 24-track tape recorder, which required a bigger console to handle 24 tracks. And 32 in, 16 out, had a producer's desk on the left so that the producer, and in this case Carole, could go over and do mixes all day long while we recorded the band on the right. Many people remember that board as the board that had holes in it, because all the pods, the channel strips were taken out, and I was in there soldering new parts onto, parts inside the console. So we would usually have sections of the console that were had their guts showing, and other parts that were actually working, and we'd swap the modules as we saw fit to do a session on a given day.
The recording studio for me has just been one of the greatest things, I guess mainly through Carole. Because just from listening to the stuff back in the studio and listening to what Carole has to say about it, and Carole showing me how to do different things, it's just been, you couldn't have a better tutor. There's just no way. I mean, I learned so much from Carole. I'm really thankful.
I became affiliate. I went to work with Mike Love and his company for a while in the late 70s, and then I went on the road, I think for the first time with the Beach Boys in 1982 or 83, something like that. The first time I actually had contact with Carole was in the mastering of a record by Ricky Martin, which Carole was the producer of. And Billy, you were affiliated with that as well.
I don't know how many people realize how many albums that Carole produced after 1965, and most of those albums were great successes, and it was Carole Wilson at the helm producing those albums.
Looking back on Carle's music as a producer and the albums that he was mostly involved in the late 60s and early 70s for the Beach Boys, like Holland, Surf's Up, and Carole and the Passions, and also his solo stuff, Carole as a music producer reminds me of a director who's a favorite of mine named Don Siegel. Don, as a director, his stuff was very clean, very precise, very tasty. Nothing happened without a reason. Wasn't overly showy, but it said amazing things in short strokes, and that's kind of how I look at Carle's productions. He's not showy, very specific and precise, everything in there for a reason, and I think all the more spectacular because of that efficiency.
Even when it was a case of, let's say, the album Carole and the Passions, and people were, looking at that saying, okay, well, here's the younger brother taking over the helm and stuff. We now go back to those albums and we go, man, wasn't there some great stuff? Even the Brian tracks that Brian contributed, and not just us Beach Boy fans, but we pull those albums apart and we go, man, there was some just wonderful stuff there. These were stepping stone albums in an obviously incredibly important career of milestones. That how do you follow up pivotal things like Pet Sounds and Smiley Smile and stuff? Well, Carole wasn't Brian, but he stepped into these shoes and he did a very, very good job.
He's very creative. He wrote songs, he produced records, he produced the Fairy Tale that we did on the Holland album, and he was amazing. I mean, he just was an amazing all-around person.
When Carole wrote songs, recorded songs, produced songs, did solo songs, he wrote it as he went. I mean, from my viewpoint, maybe there would be a chord progression and maybe in his mind he knew where the song was going to go, but it seemed to evolve track by track by track, and he had no preconceived idea what each track would do, but we might work a day or two on just one or two tracks, and then when they would really click, the song would be written up to that degree. And then, it's a 24-track tape recorder, and he would keep writing. I believe that it isn't just a Carole thing. I think this is something that the Beach Boys did a lot more than other bands. Brian especially, who, of course, Carole emulated. doing bits of songs and editing them together, doing songs that maybe have a certain basic track, and then you could finish it up 7 different ways, so you have 7 different versions of the bridge of a song. That was Karl's way of writing, I believe. More, beyond just the idea of I'm going to write a song, he would write it in the studio and build the tracks up, which to me, and remembering that this was just the advent of the 24-track when this sort of thing was more possible to do. This was a pretty educational process, because I'd heard about the way Brian worked, but I felt like I was seeing it in person with Karl, because we were building up songs that way.
As a producer, I thought it was very interesting. In the years when Brian wasn't as involved, I mean, I can hear music. That sounds, you can tell that he learned a lot from his brother. I mean, the sleigh bells and the big wall of sound production. But then in the later years, Surf's Up in Holland, where he was starting to come into his own more of as a songwriter, and he was obviously producing his own material. Very, very unique production voice. I mean, the Feel Flows, that's the other song. It's just what a great song. I mean, there's production aspects in that song. I mean, there's a fuzz guitar solo with a flute going over it. I mean, these are all, and it was very of the time. There was nothing Brian about that production.
And that song, Feel Flows, really magic, real magic going on those lead vocals. Just like, wow, unbelievable.
Heaven Could Be Here on Earth I liked.
Yeah.
And I liked Feel Flows. And I liked Long Promise Road.